Bruce, you must have something really good too.
Of course I do. It's Bruce Danielson, and I guess I'm here to entertain you too.
I call this meeting to order and welcome to the March 29th, 2021 meeting of the Audit Committee. Because we have some committee members calling in, we will do a roll call at this time.
Committee members Buckneberg. Here. Gotch.
Here.
Grant. Jensen. Here. Kiley.
Here.
Neitzert.
Here.
Sale.
Here. Okay, very good. We do have a quorum of the committee. So item number 2 is approval of the minutes from Monday, November 16th, 2020. Can I have a motion to approve?
I so move.
Second, Jensen.
Okay, motion by Sale, seconded by Jensen. Roll call vote, please.
Committee members Buckneberg.
Yes.
Gotch.
Yes.
Jensen. Yes. Kiley.
Yes?
Neitzert.
Yes.
Sale.
Yes.
Very good. That passes unanimously. And we'll go to our next item, which is one of 2 audit report reviews. The external audit results, City of Sioux Falls 2020 financial statements. And presenting that will be Ide Bailey. So if members of the Ide Bailey team can come forward, and those of you that are on the phone, if you would, well, I'll let you have them identify themselves. Okay, thank you. Introduce yourself.
Yes, good afternoon. I'm Joy Feige. I'm an audit partner in the Sioux Falls office here. And just want to facilitate in person the presentation today. So on the phone, we have Brian Stavanger. He is a governmental audit partner with our Fargo office, and he is going to be presenting a recap of the 2020 audit results. And feel free to ask questions throughout the presentation. So with that, I will turn it over to Brian.
Okay, thank you very much, Joy. Brian, it's all yours.
Thank you, Joy. Can everyone? All right. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. So as Joy mentioned, I will walk you through a recap of the 2020 audit. A lot of similar slides that we presented when we met with you in November, or met with the audit committee in November to present the plan. And I believe someone will be running the presentation for me there, and it looks like it's loading.
Brian, what you're seeing is delayed a few seconds. We're on the main slide, the title slide.
Okay, perfect. If you can go to the second slide, that will be just serve as a table of contents for us. So we'll recap the service team who assisted from Ide Bailey on the audit this year, give you a recap of the audit. There's several different reports that are issued, so we'll go through all of those. And then future considerations. There's a lot of things going on at the federal level with additional funding coming down the path, as well as some future standards that will impact your financial statements. We'll walk through that. So the next slide is the service team. And once I get into kind of the recap, I'll make sure to pause and allow for time for questions or comments. I know in this virtual world, it's sometimes hard to identify those, so I'll make sure I do some intentional pauses. This service team is the one identified back in November as your service team, and this maintained and was intact throughout the audit. So myself serving as the main engagement partner, Joy, there representing our Sioux Falls office and being that communications and relationship partner. And then Courtney Richmond, also from Fargo, serving as the manager. We both have been on this engagement for several years, certainly helps with consistency purposes and efficiency purposes. And then we have several staff members that helped out. It was a mixture of senior associates and associates from both the Sioux Falls and the Fargo office. Again, your service team did not change based on what we presented in November. The next slide will start to get into a recap of the audit. So when we enter into this audit, there's several different standards and guidelines that we're following. At a baseline is generally accepted auditing standards. And really any audit that Ide Bailey or any other public accounting firm performs, we have to follow generally accepted auditing standards. Whenever we're working with governmental entities, there's a separate, or I guess another set of standards, government auditing standards, much more compliance and internal control driven. And we also follow Title II of the U.S. Code of Federal Regulations, or CFR, and that is related to our federal audit, or the federal programs that we audit. So I'll go through the results of all of those in a little bit. When we're doing an audit, we are designing that audit to obtain reasonable assurance about whether the financial statements are free of material misstatement. So what that means is we cannot provide, or we do not provide, absolute assurance, and it's really based on the level of work that we do. We do a lot of sampling. We do not look at 100% of the transactions, and for that reason, we cannot provide absolute, but we do obtain enough audit evidence and perform enough procedures to give you reasonable assurance about your financial statements. Okay, the next slide, the timeline. This timeline was presented to you when we met on November 16th, and we were able to follow this timeline. You know, at that time, we were a little uncertain what the process would look like. You know, we believed it would be mostly remote and mostly virtual, and that did indeed happen. But we were also able to sprinkle in some on-site visits, just certain areas where it was easier to have someone from our Sioux Falls office swing by City Hall for a half a day or a few hours. So mostly remote, mostly virtual, but also had some on-site time as well. We began a lot of our work the middle of December, our interim testing. That's where we get started on, just updating any internal controls or processes, potential changes that take place. We also get started on the federal audit testing, and there's a lot of other miscellaneous items that we can get done in December and kind of move it out of that normal busy time when we come back. Our year-end testing and the bulk of our work is done in January, February, and March. We dedicate 2 full weeks, and then in between those weeks and after those weeks, we're also spending time working on it and wrapping up. But the last weeks of January and February were dedicated to the audit. And then we work in March to issue the report, the annual report, and our opinion. And we were able to issue our opinion on March 19th of 2021, which was 1 day quicker than last year, or the 2019 audit. So with all the potential challenges that were identified leading up to and planning for the audit, doing much of it remote, I think we communicated much more as an audit team with the city, more than we ever have in the past, and successfully were able to issue this really the quickest, in my experience with the city, the quickest that we've been able to issue this audit, which says a lot about the finance department and everyone at the city who assists us in all our requests and all of our questions. So a big, big thank you to them. Happy to be here at the end of March presenting this. So I'll pause there to see if anyone has any questions on the timeline before we get into the results.
Any questions, member? Any questions from members on the phone? Okay, hearing none, you're welcome to proceed.
Okay. So a recap of the financial statement audit. We're going to focus on the federal audit in a couple slides. We also have a management letter that we'll talk through. So this is really the financial statements as a whole. Our opinion was an unmodified opinion. That's a clean audit opinion. That's really what you want when you seek out an external audit of your financial statements. What that really means is that the annual report that the city prepares is fairly presented, has all the required disclosures, and we believe the numbers to be fairly stated. That comprehensive annual financial report, also called the annual report, has been received or submitted to the Government Finance Officers Association, and they have a Certificate of Excellence program. That's been submitted, and you have received that certificate for the last 40 years, which is a wonderful accomplishment. There's a lot of criteria that needs to be followed. We do anticipate that this 2020 annual report will also meet those requirements, and you will be receiving that certificate again. Throughout the 2020 audit, management did identify some restatements that needed to be, some amounts that needed to be revised in the 2020 annual report compared to previous annual reports, and I'll go through those on the next slide. Whenever there is a restatement, we as a firm at Ideally issue a finding, and technically it's called a finding. I like to call it more of an awareness to make everyone aware and be transparent of what occurred during the audit process. But we'll talk through that, and that finding really just says management identified a restatement that needed to be made. That revision was made. We give you the dollar amounts and the details behind that. Again, I'll go through that on the next slide. We also have, we identify significant estimates. So when doing an audit, I would say the easier parts of doing an audit are where we can send confirmations to a third party, such as a financial institution, a bondholder, where they can confirm to us that those cash amounts, those investment amounts, the long-term debt at the end of the year are indeed accurate. The more challenging areas to audit are where there are estimates. So other post-employment benefits, future pension liabilities, landfill liabilities. We've identified 5 or 6 of those significant estimates. It takes a little bit more work, not only on our behalf, but also management to either identify what those estimates are or even look to outside professionals to help the city identify those. So we went through, did all of our procedures, worked with management and some of those outside professionals to get comfortable that those significant estimates are materially accurate. So I'll pause there again to see if there's any questions from any audit committee members.
Okay, members, any questions? Any members on the phone, any questions? Okay, hearing none, Brian, you're welcome to proceed.
Okay, thank you. The next slide is where we will talk through those restatements that were made. And there were multiple restatements, all for the same reason, privately maintained infrastructure assets. So what happens on an annual basis is when there are infrastructure projects, storm drainage, water, those types of projects in the ground, underneath the ground, there typically are private contributions, and that's common. The significant portion of the project is funded by the city, but there are private contributions. All indications historically that were made to the finance department and through the audit process were that those private contributions were made, and then essentially ownership and responsibility for maintenance into the future transferred to the city. It was discovered by management this year that is not the case in all of those instances. There are certain instances where those private contributions, those assets, the responsibility to maintain those assets and the ownership of those assets actually remain with that private entity or that private individual. So those assets, which had been previously reported as assets of the city, had to be removed. So in the storm drainage, which is under the governmental activities umbrella within the financial statements, it was just under $2.2 million of those net infrastructure assets that needed to be removed. And then in the water fund, which is under the business type activities umbrella within the financial statements, that was just under $18 million of net infrastructure assets. That is not a one-time, that's not, hey, in 2020, those are the amounts. That storm drainage amount went back to 2002. It was an accumulation of infrastructure assets that were private contributions back to 2002. And in the water, that expanded back to 1999. So these are roughly 20 years worth of historical information that needed to be removed as assets of the city. So that restatement or those restatements were made in 2020. It's identified in our audit opinion, and then there's a footnote dedicated to it in the annual report describing everything that I just went through. So a lot to take in there, some big numbers, hopefully explained it well, but if there are any questions, certainly want to answer those for you.
Any questions from any of the members present or on the phone? Okay, seeing none. Brian?
Okay, let's move then to the federal audit. So that federal audit is really a separate audit done on the major federal programs. And when I say major, there is a calculation that is actually done by the federal government that we are required to follow, where it identifies which programs of the city we have to test. There were 2 programs that we tested in 2020, FEMA and the Coronavirus Relief Fund. Those programs really focus on, or our testing focuses on compliance, making sure that spending the money according to the grant agreements, and also internal controls. The federal government wants to ensure that there are adequate and strong internal controls for the spending of those federal grant dollars. So we had an unmodified opinion, that clean opinion, which is what you want. There were no material weakness or significant deficiency internal control findings, and also none of those for compliance. So a clean, unmodified opinion, no findings for both compliance and internal control for that federal audit. So I'll pause there again to see if there's any questions on the federal audit.
Committee members, any questions? Hearing none, Brian, you may proceed.
Okay, wonderful. So then I've got 2 more slides. They're both dedicated to the management letter. The management letter is a separately issued document. It's a 3 to 4, maybe 5-page document addressed to the audit committee, the city council, and management of the city. It's a recap, generally a recap of our processes, just required communication, but also in there we identify any potential adjustments that we passed on. And what that means is whenever we do an audit, we're auditing based on different thresholds, dollar amount thresholds. And there's a certain threshold that if it's met, we really have to work with management and say, we believe this to be an error. It's above that threshold where we can't just ignore it. We need you to make that adjustment. If it's under that threshold, we have more flexibility. We talk with management. We say, either management has potentially identified an error or we have potentially identified an error. We have a discussion. If it's under that dollar threshold, we can actually pass on it. We can say, you know what, you don't have to make the adjustment in your annual report, but it is big enough where we need to include it in the management letter. So going back to being more transparent, helping everyone understand what the process is that we go through and potential adjustments that we didn't have to post or that management didn't have to post or make an adjustment in their annual report, those are identified in this management letter. So I wanted to walk through those 4 past adjustments for you. The first one is in the sales and use tax fund, and this is actually a repeat past adjustment. We had it in 2018 and 2019 and again in 2020. There was about $562,000 of revenue that was recognized in 2017 that should not have been. It should have been a deferred revenue as the cash has not been received yet. The cash has still not been received yet, so we just have to continue to pass on it. Management is confident that money will be received soon, so that eventually we can they can remove all of that information, and we no longer will have that past adjustment. But that has been there for the last 2 years. In the water reclamation fund, we identified an understatement of depreciation. So essentially, there should have been 12 full months of depreciation expense on the books. There was only 1 month. We identified that as about $158,000, of additional expense that should have been recorded. It wasn't. It was under our thresholds. It was okay not to do that. And I'm going to continue on to the next slide because there's 2 more past adjustments. I'll give you a summary of the total of all of those and then allow for some questions. In the water reclamation fund as well, which was 2 more past adjustments, there were a total of 3 in that fund. Privately maintained infrastructure assets recorded in 2018 and 2019 amounting to about $677,000. So the restatement or revisions that were made previously that I talked about, those were also identified in that water reclamation fund, but management decided because of just the administrative burden of having to make those changes, if they didn't have to make them, they would prefer that we pass on them. We could do that in that water reclamation fund. It was under the threshold, so we passed on making that restatement in that fund. And lastly, in the water reclamation fund, there was just a timing issue. There were some capital assets that should have been recorded in 2019. They weren't recorded until 2020. So really saying that in 2019, there should have been about $514,000 more of capital assets. At the end of 2020, it's all accurate now, just identifying there was a timing issue between 2019 and 2020. So overall, the impact of these past adjustments. Essentially, there's, in the annual report, we're saying that fund balance or equity of the sales and use tax fund is overstated by about $562,000. For the water rec fund, there's an overstatement of assets of about $1.3 million, an understatement of expenses of $134,000, and an overstatement of net position or equity of about $1.2 million. Even the totality, we always have to consider the totality of any of those past adjustments. The totality of all of those still is underneath our threshold, allows us to pass on making any adjustments to the annual report. So a lot of numbers there, a lot of different scenarios. Definitely want to pause again to make sure if you have any questions that I'm able to answer them.
Okay, members present, any questions? Mr. Buckenberg.
Dean Buckenberg. Say, Brian, just, point of clarification for those of us in the room. Could you give us an example? I'm thinking about the prior period adjustment. What's an example of something that was owned privately that was picked up on the city's books, but it's going to be maintained and owned by that private party that's part of water recycling or water reclamation? Just to make it more understandable for us, do you have any specific example?
Yeah, I think, the way it was explained to me that finally made sense was, essentially the city is responsible up to the curb, and then from the curb to the structure, that is the private entity's responsibility. And so, the entire project is done all the way to that structure, but from the structure to the curb, that's that private contribution piece that it kind of depends on the project. Sometimes there's that private contribution, and then they say, you know what, city, you maintain it, you take care of it going forward. Or there's scenarios where that private entity maintains that ownership and responsibility for maintenance from the curb to the structure. So that's kind of the high level, I guess, easiest way to explain those types of situations of the restatement.
Thanks.
Does that help?
That's helpful. Thank you.
Any other members present with questions? Okay, I'll move to the phone. Any members on the phone that may have questions? Okay, hearing none. Brian, you're welcome to proceed.
Okay, one more slide of substance, and then it's just kind of some wrap-up slides. But the next slide is what's next. I talked a little bit about this in November of, the audit process feels like and looks like it's really from November through March. The reality is we're in touch with the city throughout the year. And there's constantly new standards being issued or being discussed. So we're having questions from city staff, or we're putting on trainings. So we're constantly in touch. The biggest thing right now, or the biggest few things, the American Rescue Plan. It looks like the city is going to be receiving a direct allocation of funds. There's no official proclamation of what that is, but it looks to be a sizable amount of funding that'll come. We are working with, we've submitted questions to U.S. Treasury, trying to understand, what will the impact be on these local governments? What will the requirements be? Is there going to be that federal audit requirement? Is it going to be subject to testing when the dollars are spent? So we're monitoring that. It's looking like mid to end of April is when there's going to be some more clarity around what those dollars will be, the strings attached, so to speak. So we've got personnel at Eide Bailey that actually live in D.C. or near D.C. that are monitoring that for us ongoing. GASB 87, GASB is the Governmental Accounting Standards Board. They seem to issue 3 to 4 new standards a year. The one that's really been identified as going to have an impact on the city is GASB number 87 leases. It's actually been out there for a while. It's been delayed multiple times. It was going to be effective when COVID hit. I think it was back in April. The GASB decided to delay that. So that's now, as of now, effective in 2022. So it's all about lease accounting. It doesn't matter if it's an operating lease or a capital lease. A lot of times those operating leases would be like copiers, those types of printers. Those usually are classified as operating. Capital typically is more equipment type. It's going to really say it doesn't matter what it is. If it meets certain criteria, it's going to be a lease. And that does have an impact and will have an impact on your financial statements. Looking like 2022 is when that will be in effect. We've already had multiple meetings because we thought it would be in effect sooner. Looks like we'll just continue to have some meetings surrounding that just to make sure the city's ready and we're ready. Throughout the year, though, online publications on GASB updates, federal audit changes, CARES Act, ARPA, webinars related to similar topics, all of that, kind of our ongoing annual throughout the year engagement with the city and the city staff, making sure that they're aware of what's going on and what's coming. And also, there's been some pretty unique situations and questions that city staff, the finance department has identified. We've got some access to some internal specialists here that really understand the technical aspect of governmental accounting, and we have helped and we will continue to help as those questions come up. So we'll probably take a little break from interacting with the city staff and the finance department, but nonetheless, we will be in touch soon just to make sure they have the knowledge and information that they need. So with that, I'll end and just take any final questions that anyone would have.
Okay, members, questions. Mr. Buckenberg.
Yeah, thank you. Say, Brian, I assume that GASB 87, the effect is going to be to gross up the city's assets, long-term assets, right-to-use assets, and long-term liabilities for these leases.
Correct.
And then do we have any rough estimate of what those initial dollars might be? I mean, is it the $50 million or $10 million or no estimate yet?
I am not sure the actual dollar amounts. I don't know if someone there from the city would be able to answer that. I know we had some initial conversations around, but that was so long ago I've forgotten what those numbers are.
This is Cody Papke, Chief Accountant for City of Sioux Falls. Based on our initial estimates, it's going to be about $3 to $5 million. We have some kind of motor grader leases. We have the copier printer leases and some other kind of building and vehicle leases. But it's going to have some impact, but it's not going to be a major impact. But like you say, it'll add that much debt and that much additional assets to our books. So does that help? Any other questions on that? Thanks. Good.
Any other questions from members present?
Yeah, I did have a question on the tax abatements on page 71.
Go ahead, Rose.
And this is Rose Grant. I was wondering I've heard that there's increases coming. Any idea when those will hit the financials?
Do we have a member that would like to address that question from the city?
Sean Pritchett, Director of Finance. I'm assuming she may be referring to some changes to the discretionary tax formula in terms of the abatement, and those haven't been passed, and I don't have myself a definitive timeline as to when those would occur or what the impacts would be yet.
Rose, is that what you were asking for?
Well, I just heard that there are some large tax abatements on the horizon, and I was just wondering when we might see the effects of those. Is that 1 year or 2 years?
Yeah, I think you're probably referring to some of the presentations on those discretionary tax formulas changing and how that might impact, like there's some discussion of the city proposing to change them for like multifamily housing or changing the eligibilities or changing the way they're attributed, but none of that has been firmed. It's not policy yet, and so I can't speak to what the actual financial impact is going to be.
All right, and those accounting changes are coming in 2020, 21?
We would reflect it at the time that they pass the policy, and I don't have a timeline for when that would occur yet.
All right.
Thank you, Director Pritchett.
All right, thank you.
Any other questions from any members, whether on the phone or present? Okay, then see.
Chair, before we move on, I was wondering if Director Pritchett would like to come up and talk about the letter that the Finance Department received.
Welcome back, Director.
You're putting me on the spot here, but I
She did
appreciate
it.
I do appreciate the opportunity to speak to this. In January, I believe Merit Research Services, which is a research consulting entity that looks at how well cities perform in terms of handling their financial reporting, and particularly because it's important to bond rating agencies. Those communities that report quickly and accurately are deemed to be in a positive way with our bondholders. They certainly want to see financial information quickly because they're making a fairly large investment in many communities. So they do track this and report this on an annual basis. Last year, Sioux Falls was second in the nation in terms of large communities, in terms of how quickly we report and close out our financials. For the year ending 2019, for the 2019 annual audit, we received the #1 standing in the nation for the fastest. And I don't remember, Cody, if you remember how many days it was. I think it was 80 days that we completed the audit. Yeah, and we completed in 79 days this year as well. And our second place person was, our community was the city of Columbus. However, they were dating their report before their legislative audit department was actually reviewing it. So they will not probably be as quick this year as Sioux Falls. But we take a lot of pride in doing this, particularly for our staff. They work really hard, gearing up typically in the fall of the year, already getting ready for the audit. And so it is something that they take a lot of pride in, being a community that can do this. And I would also say we do it in half the time of an average municipality in the nation. So not only first in the nation but in half the time of what our typical municipalities will generate their annual financial reports in. So I do want to give kind of a shout out to the staff. They put a lot of work into this and appreciate their efforts.
Very good, and congratulations on that. And I would say not only are you effective in terms of a timeline, but you're very efficient in terms of accuracy as well, too. While we maybe had a few changes in this particular audit, it was all well within industry standards. So I congratulate you on both sides of that. So any other questions from members related to this particular topic? Okay, may I have a motion to accept the report and submit it to the City Council pursuant to Section 32.022E of the Code of Ordinances?
So moved, Dean Bucknenberg.
Second, Neitzer.
Okay, moved by Mr. Bucknenberg and seconded by Councilor Neitzer. Roll call vote.
Committee members Bucknenberg? Yes. Gotch? Gotch?
Yes.
Jensen?
Yes.
Kylie?
Yes?
Neitzer?
Yes.
Sale?
Yes.
Okay, that passes unanimously. We'll move on to item 3B, which is another external audit report dealing with public parking enterprise risk assessment. And this too was done by Ide Bailey, so I will invite Ide Bailey to the microphones. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you again for having us. This was a proposal that we responded to on a consulting engagement. And on this engagement, I would like to introduce Derek Flanagan. He is a governmental audit partner with our Fargo office again. And then also a key member that will be on the phone as well is Kristen Taffy from our Minneapolis office, and she is a manager in our specialty services area in the business valuation. So those two work together to put together this presentation relating to the Public Parking Enterprise Fund.
Thank you, Joy. And before we go to and Derek, I'm going to ask Mr. Dave Bixler to come forward and give us just a little background into this as well. Kind of jumped the gun a little bit there. Sorry, Mr. Bixler.
All right. David Bixler, Budget Analyst for the City Council. On November 9th of 2021, the proposal was received from iBailey for the risk assessment for the parking enterprise. At that time, it was also approved by the Audit Committee, and then the Council approved the agreement the following date, November 10th, via the consent agenda. At the start of the engagement, the administration shared the parking enterprise forecast with iBailey, and during a WebEx meeting, members of the administration from Parking and Finance were available for iBailey to ask specific questions of the model and the enterprise. The administration proposed assumptions and insights. The administration provided assumptions and insights of the model along with historic information such as revenues, expenses, changes in parking structures, locations, and utilization rates. From iBailey, we have Derek Flanagan and Kristen Tafe, and they will be presenting the results on the financial model, risk assessment for the Sioux Falls Parking Enterprise, and also just want to note that they will also be presenting on April 20th to the council at an informational meeting. And with that, I'll turn it over to iBailey.
Thank you, Dave. Okay, Kristen or Derek, take it away.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Wonderful. Well, my name is Derek Flanagan, and I was previously introduced, so thanks for that, Joy. But I have Kristen with me, and we're actually going to tag team this presentation. I'm going to get things kicked off with the slides, and then Kristen is going to take over and go through what I would call more of the meat and potatoes of the presentation, and then I'm going to wrap it up at the very end of the presentation. Don't let that scare you. It's not like it's a 40-slide presentation. It's a brief presentation, but that was what we figured would be the best approach to this. So next slide, please. A little bit on the overview. So as David mentioned, in response to the risk assessment RFP, we proposed providing a financial model that would include 3 different scenarios on the parking enterprise as a whole. Because the future is so unpredictable, that is why we wanted to create multiple scenarios for everyone to see within this proposed service. This was done under the cash basis of accounting and therefore does not include non-cash items such as depreciation and has a focus on the cash at the bottom of the analysis. We perform these procedures through conversations with management and the use of historical information, as David previously mentioned. At the conclusion, we created a memo as a deliverable to detail out the key information related to the scenarios created. We were engaged to perform consulting procedures regarding this analysis, and we are not offering any assurance on the models or the achievability of the scenarios. So now I'll turn it over to Kristen to begin the discussion on the various scenarios that we created.
Thank you, Derek. So we created 3 different scenarios. They're referred to as Scenario 1, lower usage, Scenario 2, higher usage, and Scenario 3, break even. And this slide here just details a little bit of the information that we used to build out each scenario. The first thing to note is that revenue was the driver in each scenario, specifically relating to ramp and lot revenue. We modified occupancy and we utilized the known rate increases for each year. Other parking lots and leases included maintenance building and the diner lease. Those really, our understanding is that those will remain steady, so they were excluded from the analysis where we modified occupancy. And then we calculated metered revenue based on a historical percentage of lot and ramp revenue, and then enforcement was also based on a historical percentage of launch, ramp, and meter revenue. So the real drivers here are relating to the leases of ramps and lots. The expenses remain steady in each scenario. We were provided with management's projection and historical data, and we were given the opportunity to ask questions of management. Based on what we learned in those discussions, we used that projection, the expenditures noted in the management projection, as a starting point for year one expenditures. We varied a bit from management's projections with the inflationary rate of 3% for expenses outside of wages and benefits. That was 4%, same as management's projection. And then repairs and maintenance remained based on that budget. So we utilized the actual amounts included in management's projection for each year in the analysis. The debt obligations came from the loan amortization schedule, and then the available cash balance was based on the 2019 CAFR and then the roll forward estimate. So now that the 2020 CAFR is completed, obviously we are going to see a bit of a variance just that compared to what we were using at the time we created this analysis. Any questions on the initial development?
Any questions, members, either present or on the phone? Hearing none, you're welcome to proceed.
Wonderful. So the first scenario that we'll discuss is the lower usage. So the lower usage was meant to reflect the lowest, The lower usage was meant to reflect 2021 being equal to the lowest months of the year 2020. So the usage percentages for 2021 for ramps and lots are based on the lowest average occupancy in 2020. 2022 focuses on an increase from those lowest months, but still below 2019, whereas 2023 through 2025, the usage is based on the average of 2019. So that's where we assume a return to 2019 numbers. It's important to note that because the Mall Avenue ramp was opened towards, the second half of 2020, the First Avenue ramp and the Mall Avenue ramp were both impacted with that opening. Those had different treatment. For the Mall Avenue ramp and the First Avenue ramp in 2021, we utilized the occupancy rates from October to December 2020. For 2022, we increased those slightly for the Mall Avenue ramp, so from about 62% occupancy to 65% occupancy. And the First Avenue ramp went from the occupancy noted from October to December 2020 to that from June to December 2020. And then we increased a bit more from 2023 through 2025 based on discussions with management. And that was to 70% occupancy for the Mall Avenue ramp and First Avenue ramp at 65% occupancy. We want you to note that throughout this, neither of those was ever at 100% occupancy. Our findings under this scenario are on the current slide. And what you see here is under this scenario, we do have a loss in each year with a declining balance in available cash. The trend is nearly to a break even by the year 2025. There's still a bit of available cash to support operations in that year. If you have the full memo in front of you, the full schedules would be on page 6 of the memo. Any questions on scenario 1?
Yes, I do see one from a member present, Councilor Neitzer.
Yes, this is Councilor Greg Neitzer. So to be clear, the lower usage scenario is that was taking the lowest occupancy month of 2020 and then extrapolating that out for a full year for the 2021 projection?
Yes, that's correct. And it was the lowest grouping a month. So we didn't rely on one single month in 2020, but instead used groupings more like June through August or August through October, that type of thing to identify the lowest usage. And then we utilized by ramp or lot. We identified where that lowest number came in, and then that's what we utilized for 2021. And then 2022 was not the lowest, but instead more of a focus on the average for 2020. So that way it was more of a bridge between that lowest amount and what 2019 showed.
Okay, so just to be clear, that would be 2021 in the lower usage scenario would be as if we had the lowest of COVID all year long, and then 2022 is more like something like what we probably ended up with. My other question would be related to, and I know that the levers that you played with were on the revenue side. For the expenses side, you kept that to management's projections.
That's correct. For the year 2021, we relied on management's projections as a starting point, and then we increased those inflationary, like as an inflationary adjustment for each year over year.
Okay, and so obviously with the management projection, my understanding is that for 2021, they didn't project any cost cutting as it would relate to shifting employees to other departments as we did in 2020, and we did save about $100,000. So that wouldn't be, that savings in wages and salaries wouldn't be captured in this scenario. So our balance could be a little bit higher if we took some steps to offset some operating declines in revenue.
Yes, you are correct. So this management's projection that was provided for 2021, our understanding is that it did not include trying to shift those employees. And we saw that too in the salaries or the wages and benefits line item, what was actually incurred versus the forecast that management provided for 2021. It was about $150,000 of difference there. We relied on, for that year one expenditure, we relied on management's projections, which means that any of those cost savings choices or strategies that could be used are not incorporated here.
Okay, and I have, there's not calling any fault to what was plugged in, but I just want for people just to be clear that, so this would be a projection of essentially kind of, we're in COVID in terms of the revenue and we do nothing to cut costs, which obviously we proved that we could do when we were in the midst of COVID. So this would be a pretty severe scenario, I guess this would be my opinion, and that's just my opinion. So thank you.
Yes, you're welcome. Any other questions relating to scenario one?
Members present, any questions? How about members on the phone? Okay, hearing none, I do have one myself. It's based on lowest average occupancy in 2020. Can you give me the rationale for selecting 2020 versus what would probably be considered a more normal year like 2019? I can guess what your response is, but I'd rather hear it from you.
I can take that one, Kristen.
Wonderful.
We really wanted to give you, and in terms of the different scenarios, we really wanted to give you a view of what those scenarios could look like. More on the extreme side, with COVID and the uncertainty, we really just wanted to show what it could look like if it was a slow return to the new normal, so to speak. So the scenario one, you are correct. We're using, for the first year there, we're using those months within 2020 that had the lowest usage. And we just, when we were creating three different scenarios and based on some of the conversations, we just wanted to show the different usages that, rather than them being very close in terms of usage, we wanted to show two different scenarios and then a break even. And we wanted those two scenarios to show, what could happen if, COVID was a long-term, there was a long-term impact resulting from it.
Okay, and I do understand that because that was the fact of what we were dealing with at the time, but I do want to emphasize, as Councilor Neitzer was bringing out too, that is a pretty extreme scenario based on the history of the parking system and somewhat of what I would call a pessimistic approach to that, a worst case scenario situation. Does that sum that up correctly?
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with those statements. It was really to show, we call it lower usage, and that was just to show you the impact of if a situation occurred similar to the lowest months within 2020, and there was a very slow return to what I would call a new normal, we wanted to show what the impact on these numbers would be.
Okay, very good. And just, and Councilor Neitzer touched on one of my questions, so I'll be brief, but in a scenario such as that, where you are receiving extreme outside pressures that are negatively impacting the situation, normally in other business ventures, you would look at cutting potentially your wages and benefits. For instance, if you were running a restaurant, normally had 20 wait staff, but now you only had the need for 5, you're likely to just retain 5 under that scenario. And then within our parking system, we do have expenses for professional services and rentals, repair and maintenance, supplies, materials, training, utilities, capital infrastructure and equipment, benefit payments and others, but all of those could have been cut to help actually show better numbers in this scenario. And I understand that when you put scenarios together, it's basically limitless. You could consider, so you were just simply being, using the same approach throughout all 3 scenarios for the sake of consistency, I guess is my guess, but in this case, I just want to point out, as Councilor Neitzer did, that with proper management, those things could have been managed better under the circumstances. So, since
you are exactly.
Go ahead.
You are exactly correct. The rationale behind not changing the operating expenditures was really, once you start modifying multiple inputs, it becomes very hard to understand all the scenarios, because now you have too many moving pieces, and where in one scenario there's cost-cutting measures, and then in another scenario there's not cost-cutting measures. And we really wanted to focus on one input that we would modify, and we determined that the revenue usage amounts would be that key input that we could make modifications to for the various scenarios. With that being said, and it's in my last slide and how I was going to wrap up the presentation, but you know, when there is a scenario like scenario 1, we would fully expect that management would incorporate cost-cutting measures, and you know, they're going to be monitoring this on a consistent basis, and we've seen that through historical results. So, you know, not to take this scenario, which is more in a static environment where there's going to be some fluidity with management's involvement in responding to the current economic conditions, however is deemed necessary. So I wouldn't disagree with that at all.
Hey, Derek, thank you very much. Before we move on, one last call for members either on the phone or present for any questions. Okay, hearing none, go ahead and proceed to scenario 2.
Wonderful. So scenario 2 is then on the other side. Scenario 2 is focused on the higher usage, and that was really based on, let's say 2021 is the average of occupancy of 2020, and then from 2022 through 2025, we do have that return to normal or 2019 occupancy. Once again, the Mall Avenue ramp and the First Avenue ramp are a little bit different because we don't have much historical data where both of those were in operation. And instead, we base that on some conversations that we had with management about expected occupancy that they considered to be reasonable, not necessarily the reaching for the stars, it's going to fill up on day 1, but instead allowing us to still show that incline from 2021 through 2025. And then for lots, we really focused on the average of 2019. We have a little bit of a sooner return to normal just based on the trending that we saw towards the end of 2020. They didn't experience quite the same decrease that we saw in the ramp occupancy. So the results from that are as shown. We still have a loss in year 1 or 2021. And then after that, we do have growth we do have profit and then growth in the available cash balance. The profitability does vary as expenditures are growing at a faster rate than revenue is growing. And additionally, we do have ebbs and flows in the debt service. That is the debt service amounts. But what you see here is that the cash is sufficient to support operations, and then there is growth in that cash balance as well. Any questions on scenario 2?
Okay, members, Councilor Neitzer.
For the layperson, would it be fair to maybe characterize higher usage scenario 2 as kind of 2021 is essentially the recovery year, and then it's making an assumption that 2022 and beyond is kind of back to where we were pre-COVID and just growing as we have been historically?
I would say that is correct. So 2021 we would consider to be a recovery year, or the bridge to that 2019 number. The bigger assumption here is just that Mall Avenue ramp and the First Avenue ramp, we don't have, we aren't going to just rely on what First Avenue experienced in 2019. And so instead, that's where we have a little bit more of an assumption playing into it, because we cannot just rely straight on 2019 for that one. So instead, we have those equal to, sorry.
Yeah, no. I'm sorry for interrupting, but so the reference you're making is the fact that since we opened up the new ramp, that there was some movement from Mall Avenue over to the new ramp, and is that what you're referring to, that it's hard to gauge exactly the occupancy?
Exactly. Exactly. We wanted to take into consideration that the First Avenue ramp may not, be exactly what they experienced in 2019 because of the addition of the Mall Avenue ramp. Yeah. So that's why that one has a slightly different treatment.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, any other members' questions? Any members on the phone, any questions regarding scenario 2, higher usage? Okay, hearing none, you may proceed with scenario 3, break even.
Scenario 3, break even, doesn't really have that great of a chart to show you guys, only because it shows a break even. But our goal here was to say, if revenue was set equal to the total expenditures, what would the implied occupancy be? What does this look like, and how does that compare to the other scenarios that we developed? And what we found here is that the revenues for 2021 would exceed what we calculated under both scenario 1 and scenario 2. So in 2021, under scenario 1 and scenario 2, we are showing some sort of a recovery from 2020. In order to have a break-even year under this scenario, we would have to have a very strong year, is what we noted. And then after that, we also considered, what does that implied occupancy mean? So in terms of, is it feasible to reach that? And what we noted here is that the implied occupancy was based on the weighted monthly leases for both ramps and lots, so we considered them separately. The implied occupancy for the ramps overall would be below 2019, which makes sense given we have the new ramp opening like we've talked about, that we don't anticipate 100% occupancy right away. And for the lots, it does appear to be very strong occupancy in order to hit the break-even numbers. So overall, I think our biggest finding under break-even was that the break-even, the first years, in order to reach that break-even amount, the revenue would have to outpace what we noted in scenario 2, higher usage, which fits because we also showed, as you can see here, we still had a loss in scenario 2, higher usage in the first year. Any questions on what the break-even was meant to do?
Any questions from members present? Mr. Bucknenberg?
Well, I got kind of an overall question, thinking about COVID and thinking about people working from home and wondering about downtown office leasing and how that's looking now and to the future, and how we might have or talked about incorporating that into these projections. Just kind of an open-end question.
Yeah. So I think if I'm kind of understanding that correctly, is the question kind of revolves around what if the impacts of COVID are more long term than just a year or two of recovery to a new normal. And that's really where, under scenario 1, we tried to at least incorporate a much slower return to a new normal and be a little more conservative with, a lot more conservative with the usage data that we used in that scenario to really show you a scenario where if there's lasting impacts, what could that look like? Unfortunately, none of us know exactly how this pandemic is going to impact the future. But that was kind of the goal a little bit of having various scenarios, is to show you what those impacts could be.
Thank you. Any questions from any member on the phone? Okay, back to you, either Kristen or Derek.
The next slide that we're showing is just management's projection that we were provided with at the beginning of this exercise. And this is just more for informational purposes. And just to show you that here, you can also see that they are putting dollars to the available cash balance starting in 2022. There is still a loss in 2021, but it appears that we just have a slower recovery as compared to management's projection.
And I will take the last slide. So
before we move, I think
kind of went.
If I can interrupt you, Derek, I think we do have one question based on what Kristen just mentioned. Councilor Neitzer, did you have a comment or question?
Yes, I do. One of the things that I think some may have been looking for out of this was your opinion as to if you believe that the management's projections that we're looking at here are based on historical data, are obviously you can't give assurance, but that they're reasonable and make sense, and I guess that'd be the best way to put it.
Yeah, and so we mentioned previously that we were able to have conversations with management and really get into discussions on this projection and how it was determined. And as Kristen mentioned earlier, we may have had some differences in terms of a percentage of inflation, but we didn't have anything that was extreme in nature when we were looking at this projection where we saw it and it was completely unreasonable. I mean, the conversations with management were, they were knowledgeable and able to provide answers to our questions. And so I would say, just through that, and also with our analysis as part of this, when we looked at management's projections, we didn't see anything that was completely unreasonable.
Okay, thank you.
And just to build off of that, I would say that at the end of this, we just did like a loose view of how these all, look together, all these different scenarios, including management's projection. And the more notable thing was that there was just in management's projections a quicker return to the normal. However, we did notice in 2023 through 2025, when scenario 2 was relying on results of 2019, then we were really getting more in line. The available cash balance noted in management's projection is really because of that quicker return to normal, being able to push down dollars a little bit sooner than what we noted in scenario 2, I would say.
Okay, thank you. Okay, go ahead and proceed.
And this is the last slide, so I'll wrap this up with just some notes of consideration, which were already touched on based on the discussion that we had previously, but nonetheless, I will just touch on it here that usage was the key input that was modified under our different scenarios. And as such, the model doesn't include other potential initiatives such as cost control measures. We would anticipate that management, they're going to be monitoring with everything that's going on in the world today and the, with the pandemic, and, they're going to be monitoring this. And if necessary, they have the ability to incorporate cost control measures. But the reason we didn't include it within our analysis is that we found when we have too many moving pieces, it becomes very difficult to understand the different scenarios. And so that was the rationale behind just having one input that we would modify based on usage. With that being said, the parking enterprise doesn't operate in a static environment, and so they can incorporate measures, such as delaying projects, variable expenditures and reducing, and it's not limited to what's listed on this slide. I mean, there's, they'll be monitoring that and can take initiative to whatever, and that's not incorporated in our scenarios is the key point I wanted to make. And that is the last slide. So at this point, I would turn it over to you to see if there are any questions or discussion items that you would like to have.
Okay, members, any questions over any portion of this report? Councilor Neitzer?
So for me, really, I guess the $1 million question is the RFP asks firms to, quote, analyze the viability of the Sioux Falls parking enterprise. So what was your verdict as to the viability of the parking enterprise fund?
Yeah, you know, just in terms of when we created these different scenarios, we created one that was kind of a, you know, I don't want to say a doom and gloom, but just a difficult conditions type scenario whereby usage would be impacted drastically by COVID and or any other factors for that matter. And then we created a different scenario, scenario 2, where things were to return to normal in a much quicker, you know, time frame. And so in doing so, you know, we kind of gave you a little look into both. Now, in scenario 1, you ate into the cash under that scenario and under those usage inputs, but you still had cash at the end of 5 years, even with that very difficult financial conditions scenario. And then scenario 2, you were able to increase your cash in total. And so if that scenario usage were to occur, you would, you know, your cash position would even increase after 5 years. And so, you know, just kind of looking at it from that standpoint and looking at those, you know, the $1 million question being, you know, is there, you know, what's it going to look like in 5 years? I don't know, but, you know, just giving you those two different scenarios, will it likely occur somewhere in the middle? You know, I don't think that's a leap of faith to say that. But hopefully that gave you some context on just what the different scenarios would look like based on usage. Now, with scenario 1, that was a pretty conservative look at the picture of the parking enterprise, and as mentioned in previous discussions, did not include any cost-cutting measures. And so, you know, if you were to take that scenario and include some cost-cutting measures to it that were able to be achieved, that would improve that scenario, and you had available cash even at the end of it, even without taking the cost-cutting measures. And so that would only just improve that scenario. So hopefully that gives you some context on, you know, what the parking enterprise could look like based on a couple of different scenarios, and you know, give you some financial information based on the usage that we've incorporated into these scenarios.
It does. Thank you very much.
Any members present? Any other questions? Okay, seeing none here. Anybody on the phone have any questions? Okay, hearing none, I'll wrap this up and thank you, Derek.
Thank you.
I will point out that this assessment was requested pre-pandemic, of course, and it was delayed because of COVID, and then we started it up, and you did an excellent job. I was happy to hear that the amount of communication actually increased, and so I think it's a model that you could probably incorporate into the coming years too. So it was difficult for you to put this together in a once every 100 years pandemic. So hopefully your team has taken notes for future members, well into the future members of Eide-Bailly. So if they ever have to do an assessment of this nature under these circumstances, again, they at least have a game plan to follow. Okay, having said that, I'm just going to remind everybody that this item will be presented to the full City Council on April 20th again. So, will somebody make a motion to accept the report and submit it to the city council pursuant to section 32.022E of the Code of Ordinances?
So moved, Neitzer.
I will,
Okay, moved
I
by,
will second Rose Grant.
okay, motion made by Councilor Neitzer and seconded by Member Grant. Roll call vote, please.
Committee members Bucknerberg,
Yes?
Gotch,
Yes.
Grant,
Yes.
Jensen,
Yes.
Kylie,
Yes.
Neitzer,
Yes.
Sale.
Yes.
Very good, that passes unanimously. We move to item number 4 on the agenda, committee member remarks. Do we have any remarks from committee members present or on the phone? Okay, hearing none, we'll move on to public input, which should be limited to items discussed here this afternoon. Any member of the public wish to come forward for public input? Okay, seeing none, this meeting is adjourned.